Hi, my name is Dan Petrovici. I'm a senior lecturer at Kent Business School, University of Kent. In the last 20 years, I have been interested in the topic of consumer behavior and advertising, with a particular focus on food and health. Today, I would like to share with you my thoughts as well as the current knowledge we have about the topic of breaking habits and what is the role of advertising in breaking these habits. Now, first of all, let's start by looking at what habits are. We all have in our lives on a daily basis habits which bring us stability, which create routines, such as, for example, brushing teeth on a regular basis. And in the case of athletes, they have habits such as training with a certain intensity, which can bring success. But also, some other habits can hold us back for some reason. And sometimes we know they are not good for our body or for our mind, and they hold us back, as I said. Why habits are very hard to break and to change? Well, first of all, because at the psychological level, these habits create neural pathways, connections, wire the brain in a certain way, which sometimes becomes repetitive, and we become less aware of them or less conscious of them. Habits also help us to regulate our emotions. So, for example, you can have chocolate to eat when you feel very good, to lift even further your mood, to celebrate something. Or when we feel very low, whether we feel sad, angry, or stressed, no matter what is the source of stress, we can actually resort to habits such as alcohol, cigarettes, or eating sugary food a bit too often. So these habits will impregnate in our mind and in our behavior and become automated, and they are very hard to change. And we resist to habits for various reasons. There are at least two psychological mechanisms which make us resisting to this change in behavior. So the first one is blocking information. Psychologists call it disengaging attention, distracting ourselves, not acknowledging the information about cigarettes, in this case, of the talk, and health. And, for example, switching the pack of cigarettes or not paying attention, as I said. It was found that actually smokers are pretty good at switching off information. They avoid information, especially negative information. The second mechanism is that we leave the information. We acknowledge that it's very hard to block it, but we are aware of this. But at the same time, we attach a different meaning to our behavior. So we found that, yes, we smoke, but we also eat healthy and do exercise. So we can rationalize in our mind. Now, in emotion, cognitive and emotional regulation psychology, we call this cognitive reappraisal. We reappraise the situation to look good and to feel good about ourselves and to carry on living without stress. Psychologists say this second route is more adaptive because at least allows the information to penetrate in our mind and is more compatible to long-term goals. But at the same time, from the point of view of changing behavior, it's an identical effect. We don't change behavior, we find a way to live with our behavior and rationalize, as I said. We either derogate the source we think is not going to happen to me, which we call optimistic bias. Other people have smoked for 50 years and nothing happened to them. So there are many, many ways in which we can rationalize. Now, I just wanted to give you one example from a consumer forum in North America. So this is somebody who has been to many, many, many life circumstances, as you could see. So, yes, he was a former anti-smoker, but now his mother was diagnosed with cancer. The girlfriend broke up the relationship, and he needs a stress relief. And quite often smokers invoke this reason. You get used to relieve your stress with the act of smoking. And look at the illustration, a perfect illustration of how it can be justified. Is not as bad as other behaviors. It's not as bad as taking drugs or alcohol, when it can lead to violence in family, or people actually putting people at stress because they need money to buy drugs and so on. So socially it's more acceptable. So this is just one rationalization. So no matter what is the reason people block, the important thing is that we want to find a way in which people can actually consider changing behavior. And let's look a little bit at what happens with advertising. We know that social media is now by far the most important channel of advertising. And when it comes to new generation which can be at risk of, for example, taking on smoking, they pay very little attention. So you can imagine the challenges we have, the fact that we need to communicate something which is uncomfortable, people block information, they may not be ready to change, and they pay little information. You can see here between 1.5 seconds scrolling down on the mobile phone and just over 2 seconds in terms of looking at the tablet. So the challenges we have is that people are desensitized, they are fed up with being told what to do, they are very negative, also they pay very little attention. And yet it was found that in a fraction of a second, 0.25 to be precise, we can process information. And especially images are very powerful in terms of processing information. If you see an image compared to text only, it gets into your mind and is going to be processed. It may make an impact, but at least it's processed. So it's possible. But the challenge it is that it was found with smoking studies that people also are very negative to graphic images, especially when it comes to warnings. 80% of the smokers at some point ignored and felt very, very negative towards these messages as opposed to text only. So let's look a little bit at how in this field of social marketing, departments of health or NGOs approach this topic. So you can see one illustration here with an NHS campaign carried out a couple of years back, which is a perfect illustration of the approach used in social marketing, trying to scare people with some facts about disease or about losing days or years of life by smoking. In this particular case, the message is every time you smoke, your blood gets thick and dirty with toxins. There are about 4,000 chemicals in cigarettes, but sometimes simply saying the facts doesn't make an impact unless it resonates with some people emotionally at a personal level and creates an urge to change behavior. There are other examples such as lungs, blood arteries, which are blocked by the act of smoking, and reflects this approach of physical threats, physical warnings. There is another approach which in the last years gained more popularity, looking at social threats. For example, the threat of premature aging, of having a bad breath, or being maybe rejected by the peers in terms of appearance. And this can be very fertile for adolescents whose sense of identity is more shaped by how they interact with peers and how they further on develop their own image. So we looked at reasons people block information. We look at what are the approaches. Now let's look a little bit at some questions in an advertising campaign we can raise. The first question is, who is going to endorse a message? Now we have, broadly speaking, two routes. We can have experts in health and health policy or medical professionals telling us why it's good to quit smoking or eat healthy and so on. They have the medical credibility based on their knowledge. The other route is also the route where a former smoker gives a personal testimonial of why she or he quit or wished would have abandoned this smoking, and perhaps it was too late. So the Singaporean Health Board had a campaign where a lady who has mouth cancer talks about the drama, and the tagline is quitting is hard, but not quitting is harder, and gives a personal testimonial that she wished she did quit early. And sometimes people need this urge, something maybe which is shocking to consider changing their behavior. But it can also backfire because, as I said, it can trigger emotions which are very negative or put people off. So let's look a little bit at these issues and how they are illustrated in research we conducted here at the University of Kent. And you could see that in the case of these two countries we looked at smokers, adult smokers. We looked at Canada and Greece, and we found that it doesn't make a difference whether we use a health professional expert or a non-expert, a past smoker in Canada. But in Greece, it made a difference. In Greece, experts were associated with a higher perceived credibility and a higher intention to quit smoking as a result of seeing the images depicting different threats. So this can bring us to a first conclusion that it doesn't necessarily matter whether you use experts or non-experts, but what matters is whether you really resonate at a personal level with the members of the audience. And non-experts, as I said, past smokers actually can create that sense of empathy, solidarity. It's someone like me talking to you and I understand your problems and I'm talking from my real life experience. The second question is also what kind of emotions we can have in an advertising campaign. Now, as I said, traditionally we focused a lot on fear and guilt with these kind of images of risk of disease, of morbidity, or mortality, and so on. But there is a whole range of emotions which can be used, positive and negative. But if we look a little bit at an illustration of emotions here, I would like to share with you a couple of facts we found in a study in the United Kingdom looking at adolescents. So we looked deliberately at an early age where prevention can matter, makes a difference because people don't have such established habits. And we found three interesting facts. Number one is that non-smokers, ironically, detect more threat from these messages than smokers. 75% more threat actually than smokers. But once smokers perceive that they are a threat, they are more likely to quit. So the challenge is how to actually make them perceive that it's relevant for them and they need to make a behavioral change. And then another interesting finding is that the same image creates different emotions. So we had the image of lungs and risk of lung disease, evoking here physical threats. And we could see the responses among non-smokers and smokers. Non-smokers felt disgusted and smokers felt the strongest perceived emotion was guilt, which we were thinking it might be the case. But it also meant that smokers didn't feel disgusted. So in other words, perhaps they rationalized and became part of their identity. And if you are not disgusted, for example, you cannot perceive negatively the act of smoking. Rather than thinking about the chemicals in the cigarette, you think about how good it feels. You don't have a problem with your image. Again, you are not likely to do anything about it. The same pattern was regarding social threats. So we have here the threat, the warning of being rejected by peers because of bad breath or image. And non-smokers felt, interestingly, sad and guilty. Perhaps sad for the smokers. It doesn't apply to me, but I feel sad. And guilty maybe that they ostracized a friend for being a smoker. And smokers reacted not necessarily through shame or embarrassment, which are typical emotions related to social circumstances, but they felt anger. They felt angry with themselves. And anger can trigger behavioral change. It's a very strong emotion, but it's also a very explosive emotion. It's very hard to control, has its own dynamic. You can be angry for a minute and then you calm down. And the problem with anger is twofold. The first one is anger can be transferred to the source and becomes what they call a boomerang effect. I hate you for telling me what to do. But also anger at a psychological level takes a lot of energy from us. And is this very mental energy which is required to change behavior. We need confidence that we can change behavior. We need to be motivated, but we also need to feel that we have the right energy and it makes the effort valuable. All these factors need to be there in order to make an impact. So we looked at the issue of who is going to be in the ad, who is endorsing. We looked at a variety of threats and emotions which can be triggered. So let's look now at the third question. Does it make a difference in terms of how you tell people to change their behavior or not? And we have, again in psychology, a couple of perspectives which look at framing a message. Are you going to focus on telling me that by quitting smoking, I'm going to gain more days of life, are going to feel better, focus more on benefits? Or are you going to focus on the fact that by continuing to smoke, I'm going to lose out minutes of my life, days of my life, maybe years if it accumulates, so on losses. And this applies to different fields of behavior. In finance, for example, they found that we are more sensitive to losses of our own savings, for example, than gains on average. But people have different ways of thinking. Some of us are more predisposed to see losses, some of us are more predisposed to see gains. It's a bit like the analogy of the glass which is half empty. You either see the empty side or you see the side which is full. So let's look a little bit at some examples here in the context of our research at the University of Kent on smoking. So does smoking matter? So the first finding we have in both Greece and Canada, it doesn't make a difference. You could see there positive and negative messages are equally effective. Telling people how much they gain or lose worked equally well, or equally bad if you are to be critical. But what it made a difference is whether people were really motivated to change their behavior. So in other words, if people had a very low motivation, they were happy with the image they have as a smoker, they reacted better to messages about gains and benefits, not losses, because they were at a stage, or what we call in psychology, early behavioral change. They were not really strongly in favor of changing their behavior, perhaps, and they can react very negatively to these messages about costs and losses and so on. So again, we see that both routes can be effective, and in some dietary studies it was found that people respond better to positive messages about gains rather than losses. So now to summarize, what I wanted to share with you is the challenges we have in terms of breaking habits. We looked at two mechanisms of breaking habits: cognitive reappraisal and disengagement of attention. And also we found that both experts and non-experts can work very well, depending on the circumstances. And framing a message in terms of gains and losses again can work very well, but it depends on the motivation to change, on the type of behavior, and perhaps on the way people think in terms of gains or losses. Thank you for your attention.